Hello everyone. Before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment saying where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories like this. Now let's begin. I'm a 22-year-old guy, and this happened to me about 3 years ago, back when I was still in college. I was living in a small town in northern Michigan, the kind of place where the roads are lined with thick pine trees and the gas stations are few and far between. I just finished a late-night shift at the local diner, and I was driving home along one of those long, empty highways that seemed to stretch on forever. It was the middle of winter, and the snow was coming down hard, making it almost impossible to see more than a few feet in front of my headlights. My gas tank was running low, lower than I'd realized, so when I saw the flickering neon sign for a 24-hour gas station, I pulled in without a second thought. The place looked old, almost abandoned, with just one other car parked out front and a single light buzzing above the door. I remember thinking it was weird how quiet everything was, even for that time of night. As I stepped out of my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just off. Like I was being watched, even though I couldn't see anyone around. I zipped up my jacket and started pumping gas, trying to ignore the way the wind seemed to howl through the empty lot. The snow was coming down even harder now, swirling around the pumps and making everything look blurry and unreal. I glanced at the other car parked near the building, a beat-up old sedan, its windows fogged up so I couldn't see inside. There was no sign of anyone in the driver's seat, and for a second, I wondered if maybe the car had been abandoned. As I waited for the tank to fill, I heard a faint scraping sound coming from behind the station, like something metal being dragged across concrete. I told myself it was probably just the wind, or maybe some loose piece of siding, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to focus on the numbers ticking up on the gas pump, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finished, I headed inside to pay. The inside of the station was even more rundown than it looked from the outside. The lights flickered overhead, casting weird shadows on the stained linoleum floor. The shelves were half empty, and there was a weird, musty smell, like old newspapers and something else I couldn't quite place. I noticed a display of snacks knocked over near the back, bags of chips scattered everywhere, like someone had gone through them in a hurry. There was no one at the counter. I rang the little bell, but nobody came out. I could hear a radio playing softly somewhere in the back, the static making it hard to tell what song was on. I started to feel uneasy, like I was intruding on a place I wasn't supposed to be. Every so often, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow flickering past the doorway to the storage room, or something shifting behind the shelves. I kept telling myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched was getting stronger by the second. I stood there for what felt like forever, clutching my wallet and glancing nervously at the empty counter. The radio static seemed to get louder, almost drowning out the sound of the wind rattling the windows. I was about to just leave some cash on the counter and get out of there when I heard it, a soft, shuffling noise coming from the hallway behind the register. It sounded like footsteps, slow and dragging, as if someone was limping or trying not to be heard. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking a little. "Is anyone there? I just need to pay for my gas." No answer. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the static from the radio. Then, just as I was about to turn and leave, I heard a whisper. It was so faint I almost thought I imagined it, but it was definitely there, a low, breathy voice saying something I couldn't quite make out. It sounded like it was coming from the storage room at the end of the hall. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were wet footprints on the linoleum, leading from the back hallway toward the counter. They were fresh, glistening in the harsh light, and they definitely weren't mine. I looked down at my own boots, dry, except for a little snow around the edges. Whoever had made those prints was still here. I backed away, glancing over my shoulder at the door. I could see my car through the glass, the snow piling up on the windshield. I was about to make a run for it when I caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of the freezer door. Someone was standing at the end of the aisle, half hidden behind a rack of magazines. I couldn't see their face, just a dark shape, hunched and unmoving. The whispering started again, louder this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from the storage room anymore. It was coming from right behind the shelves, just a few feet away from me. I could make out words now, but they didn't make any sense. It was like someone was repeating the same phrase over and over, their voice trembling. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my wallet. I didn't know what was happening, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out. I turned and bolted for the door, not daring to look back. As I sprinted toward the door, I heard the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps behind me, fast, uneven, and getting closer. The whispering had turned into frantic muttering, words tumbling over each other, echoing off the empty shelves. My hand fumbled for the door handle, slick with sweat and shaking so hard I could barely grip it. For a split second, the door wouldn't budge, like something was holding it shut from the outside. I slammed my shoulder into it, desperate, and finally it gave way, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I stumbled out into the snow, slipping and nearly falling as I raced for my car. Behind me, I heard the door bang open and the muttering voice spill out into the night, louder now, almost a wail. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw a figure standing in the doorway, tall, thin, with wild hair and clothes hanging off them in tatters. Their face was pale and twisted, eyes wide and unblinking, fixed right on me. For a split second, our eyes met, and I felt a jolt of pure terror shoot through me. There was something wrong with their face, something off about the way their mouth moved, like they were trying to speak but couldn't form the words. I yanked open my car door and dove inside, slamming it shut and fumbling with the keys. The figure started toward me, stumbling through the snow, arms outstretched. I could hear them now, their voice hoarse and broken, repeating that same phrase over and over. "Don't leave me. Don't leave me. Don't leave me." I finally got the engine to turn over, and as the headlights flickered on, I saw the figure just a few feet from my window, their breath fogging up the glass. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning on the icy pavement, and tore out of the lot, not daring to look back until the gas station was nothing but a distant, flickering light in my rearview mirror. I didn't stop driving until I was back in the safety of my apartment, doors locked and lights on. My hands were still shaking so badly, I could barely dial 911. I told the dispatcher everything, about the footprints, the whispering, the person who chased me. They said they'd send someone out, but when I called the station the next day, the officer told me they hadn't found anyone there. The only thing out of place was that old sedan, still sitting in the lot, its windows frosted over and empty. No one ever claimed it. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something back with me, that those desperate words were still echoing in the back of my mind. I never drove that stretch of highway again, and I avoided late-night shifts whenever I could. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear that voice, soft, pleading, just outside my window. I try to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and scared and seeing things that weren't there. But every now and then, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear it again. Don't leave me. I'm a 29-year-old woman, and this happened to me last summer, just outside a tiny desert town in New Mexico. I was on a solo road trip, trying to clear my head after a rough breakup. I'd been driving for hours, the sun long gone, and the only light came from my headlights and the endless stars overhead. My phone had barely any signal, and I hadn't seen another car for miles. I was running low on gas, so when I finally spotted a faded sign for a 24-hour station, I felt a wave of relief. The place was a single, lonely building surrounded by nothing but sand and scrub brush, with a couple of old pumps out front and a flickering, open sign in the window. I pulled in, the gravel crunching under my tires, and noticed how quiet everything was. No crickets, no wind, just the hum of the lights. As I stepped out, I caught a whiff of something strange like burnt plastic or old meat, and for a second I wondered if I should just keep driving. But my tank was almost empty, and I told myself I was just being paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from somewhere out in the darkness. I started pumping gas, glancing around at the empty lot and the dark desert stretching out in every direction. The station looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. Cracked windows, faded paint, and a single security camera hanging crookedly above the door. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling in my stomach, but little things kept catching my attention. There was a payphone by the door, the receiver dangling and swinging gently, even though there was no wind. I thought I saw movement in the reflection of the station's windows, but when I turned, there was nothing there, just my own shadow stretching across the gravel. When I finished filling up, I went inside to pay. The air was thick and stale, and the overhead lights buzzed so loudly it was almost disorienting. The shelves were mostly empty, except for a few dusty cans and some expired snacks. There was a stack of newspapers by the counter, all from years ago, and a faded help wanted sign taped to the register. The clerk was nowhere to be seen. I called out, but only my own voice echoed back at me. As I waited, I noticed a row of Polaroid photos taped to the wall behind the counter. They were all of people standing in front of the gas station, smiling awkwardly. Some of the photos looked recent, but others were yellowed and curling at the edges. I leaned in to look closer and realized that in every single photo, the person had the same uneasy expression, like they were forcing a smile, but their eyes were scared. I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself I was just tired and letting my imagination get the best of me. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt like someone, or something, was watching me from just out of sight. I was about to leave some cash on the counter and get out of there when I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the back room. It was slow and rhythmic, like someone drumming their fingers on a table. I called out again, a little louder this time, but there was still no answer. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, shuffling noise, like feet dragging across the floor. My heart started to race. I glanced at the door, considering just leaving, but something made me stay. Maybe curiosity, maybe the fear of running out of gas in the middle of nowhere. Suddenly, the lights flickered and dimmed, plunging the store into a weird, shadowy half-darkness. I heard a whisper, so soft I almost missed it, coming from the aisle behind me. It sounded like someone saying my name, but drawn out and distorted, as if it was being spoken underwater. I spun around, but the aisle was empty. The only thing out of place was a single can of soup, rolling slowly across the floor, as if someone had just knocked it off the shelf. I backed away, my skin crawling, and nearly tripped over a pile of old magazines. That's when I noticed fresh footprints in the dust on the floor, bare feet, leading from the back room to the counter, and then disappearing behind the shelves. They were too small to belong to an adult, but too large for a child. I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but then I heard the whisper again, closer this time, right behind me. I turned and caught a glimpse of something moving in the reflection of the freezer door. It was a figure, hunched and pale, with long, tangled hair covering its face. It darted out of sight before I could get a good look, but I could hear it breathing, ragged and desperate. I bolted for the door, but as I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. It was like it had been locked from the outside. I pounded on the glass, shouting for help, but the only response was the sound of footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, from the back of the store. I pressed myself against the door, heart hammering, as the footsteps grew louder and the whispering turned into a guttural, inhuman growl. Just as I thought I was trapped, the lights flickered again, and I saw the figure step out from behind the shelves. It was taller than I'd realized, its limbs too long and thin, its skin almost gray in the harsh fluorescent light. Its face was hidden behind that curtain of hair, but I could see its mouth moving, whispering my name over and over in a voice that didn't sound human. It started moving toward me, its bare feet making no sound on the dirty floor. I grabbed a metal display rack and shoved it between us, sending snacks and magazines flying everywhere. The thing barely flinched, just kept coming, reaching out with one bony hand. I scrambled behind the counter, searching for anything I could use as a weapon, and my hand landed on the old payphone receiver. Without thinking, I yanked it free and hurled it at the figure. It hit with a dull thud, and for a split second, the thing stopped, its head jerking up as if it was listening for something. That was all the time I needed. I dove for the emergency exit at the back of the store, praying it wasn't locked. To my relief, the door swung open, and I burst out into the cold desert night, gasping for air. I didn't look back, I just ran, stumbling through the sand and brush until I reached the road. My car was still there, engine idling, headlights cutting through the darkness. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped off, not stopping until I was miles away from that cursed place. I made it to the next town, shaking and covered in dust, and called the police. They sent someone out to check the station, but when I followed up the next day, they told me the place had been abandoned for years. No one had worked there, and there were no records of anyone matching my description stopping by that night. The photos I'd seen on the wall? The officer said there were no photos, just peeling paint and empty shelves. I still don't know what I saw that night, or what would have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. Sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A pale face, a curtain of tangled hair, watching me from the darkness. I try to tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know I'll never stop looking over my shoulder. And I'll never, Ever stop for gas in the middle of nowhere again? I'm a 35-year-old man, and this happened about 5 years ago when I was working as a long-haul trucker. I'd been driving through rural Arkansas, hauling a load of furniture to Dallas. It was late, probably close to 2 a.m., and I was exhausted, running on nothing but coffee and bad gas station snacks. I remember the road was pitch black, with only the occasional farmhouse light in the distance. My rig was running low on fuel, so when I saw a small, old-fashioned gas station glowing at the edge of the woods, I pulled in. The place looked like it hadn't changed since the 60s. One pump, a tiny office, and a single, flickering bulb above the door. There were no other cars, and the woods pressed in close on all sides, making the place feel even more isolated. I figured I'd fill up, grab a soda, and get back on the road. But as soon as I stepped out of my truck, I noticed how unnaturally quiet it was. No crickets, no wind, not even the sound of my own footsteps on the gravel. It was like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I started pumping gas, glancing around at the shadows just beyond the edge of the lights. The woods seemed to swallow up the glow, making it impossible to see more than a few feet past the pump. I tried to shake off the nerves, telling myself I was just tired, but little things kept nagging at me. There was a strange, sweet smell in the air, almost like rotting fruit, and I kept thinking I saw movement between the trees. Just quick flashes, like someone ducking out of sight. When I finished, I walked up to the office to pay. The inside was cramped and cluttered, with old license plates nailed to the walls and a dusty rack of snacks by the door. The guy behind the counter was an older man, probably in his 70s, with a blank stare and a faded trucker cap pulled low over his eyes. He barely looked up as I came in, just mumbled the total and waited for me to hand over my card. As I was paying, I noticed a row of Polaroids taped to the wall behind him. They were all of trucks, big rigs like mine, parked in front of the station. Some of the photos looked recent, but most were old and yellowed. In every single one, the truck was empty. No driver, no passengers, just the vehicle sitting alone in the lot. I asked the old man about them, but he just shrugged and said, "People come and go. Not all of them leave." That sent a chill down my spine. I tried to laugh it off, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. As I turned to leave, I thought I heard something scrape against the side of my truck outside, like fingernails on metal. I paused, listening, but the old man just stared at me, his eyes suddenly sharp and alert. I hurried out, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness just beyond the lights. As I stepped outside, the air felt even heavier, like the humidity had doubled in the few minutes I'd been inside. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone lurking near my truck, but the lot was empty. Still, I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I walked around to check the side of my rig, and sure enough, there were fresh scratches along the metal, long, thin marks that hadn't been there before. They looked almost like claw marks, but I tried to convince myself it was just a branch or something I'd brushed against on the drive. I climbed back into the cab, locked the doors, and started the engine. As the headlights flicked on, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the woods, a pale shape, low to the ground, darting between the trees. My heart started pounding. I leaned forward, squinting into the darkness, but whatever it was had vanished. I tried to shake it off and pulled out of the lot, but as I drove down the empty road, I kept seeing flashes of movement in my mirrors. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the back of the cab. It was faint, but steady, like someone drumming their fingers on the metal. I checked my mirrors again, but there was nothing there. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and then I heard a low, guttural whisper, so quiet I almost missed it. It sounded like someone saying my name, over and over, just outside the window. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to focus on the road, but the whispering got louder, filling the cab until it was all I could hear. Suddenly, something slammed against the back window, hard enough to rattle the glass. I jerked the wheel, nearly swerving off the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a pale, twisted face pressed against the glass, eyes wide and mouth stretched into a silent scream. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop on the shoulder, heart racing so fast I thought it would burst. I spun around, but the face was gone. The only thing left was a smear of something dark and sticky on the window, slowly dripping down the glass. I sat there, frozen, too scared to move, as the whispering faded into the night. I knew I had to get out of there. I floored the gas, tires spinning on the gravel as I tore down the highway, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and that gas station. But the further I drove, the more it felt like something was following me. The tapping started up again, this time on the passenger side window, soft at first, then growing louder and more frantic. I risked a glance and saw a pale hand, impossibly long fingers splayed against the glass, keeping pace with my truck even as I pushed 80 miles an hour. The face appeared again, just outside the window, eyes locked on mine, mouth moving in a silent plea. I could see its breath fogging up the glass, leaving behind streaks that spelled out my name. I swerved, trying to shake it, but the thing clung to the side of the cab, its body twisting and contorting in ways that didn't seem possible. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen was nothing but static. The whispering filled the cab, louder than ever, drowning out the roar of the engine. In a final burst of panic, I slammed on the brakes and threw open the door, stumbling out onto the side of the road. The thing let out a guttural, inhuman wail and vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only the echo of its voice and the lingering smell of rot. I stood there, shaking, until the sun started to rise, too afraid to get back in the truck, too scared to look back at the woods. When daylight finally broke, I forced myself to check the truck. The scratches were still there, and the smear on the window had dried to a rusty brown stain. I drove straight to the nearest town and called my dispatcher, making up a story about engine trouble. I never told anyone what really happened that night, not my boss, not my friends, not even my wife. I avoided that stretch of road from then on, and I never stopped at another lonely gas station if I could help it. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that tapping on the window, or catch a glimpse of a pale face in my mirrors. I try to tell myself it was just exhaustion, just a trick of the mind. But every time I see a row of Polaroids in a gas station, I wonder how many other drivers never made it out of those woods. And I wonder if, one night, I'll see my own truck in one of those photos, empty, waiting for someone else to come along. I'm a 19-year-old college student, and this happened during my first year away from home. I'd just finished finals and was driving back to my parents' house in rural Pennsylvania. It was late, close to midnight, and I was exhausted, but I wanted to get home as soon as possible. The highway was empty, and the only light came from my headlights and the occasional distant farmhouse. My gas gauge was dipping dangerously low, so when I saw a small, old gas station just off the road, I pulled in without thinking. The place looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, just 2 pumps, a tiny convenience store, and a single, flickering light above the door. There were no other cars, and the woods pressed in close on all sides, making the place feel even more isolated. I figured I'd fill up, grab a snack, and get back on the road. But as soon as I stepped out of my car, I noticed how quiet it was. No wind, no bugs, not even the sound of my own footsteps on the cracked pavement. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started pumping gas, glancing around at the shadows just beyond the reach of the lights. The woods seemed to swallow up the glow, making it impossible to see more than a few feet past the pumps. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling in my stomach, but little things kept catching my attention. There was a strange metallic smell in the air, and I kept thinking I saw movement between the trees, just quick flashes, like someone ducking out of sight. When I finished, I walked up to the store to pay. The inside was cramped and cluttered, with old candy bars and dusty soda bottles on the shelves. The guy behind the counter was middle-aged, with a thick beard and tired eyes. He barely looked up as I came in, just mumbled the total, and waited for me to hand over my card. As I was paying, I noticed a wall of missing person flyers near the door. There were dozens of them, some faded and yellowed, others more recent. All of them had the same general description: young people, travelers, people passing through. I asked the clerk about them, but he just shrugged and said, "People get lost out here. Happens all the time." That sent a chill down my spine. I tried to laugh it off, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. As I turned to leave, I thought I heard something scrape against the side of my car outside, like fingernails on metal. I paused, listening, but the clerk just stared at me, his eyes suddenly sharp and alert. I hurried out, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness just beyond the lights. As I stepped outside, the air felt even heavier, like the humidity had doubled in the few minutes I'd been inside. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone lurking near my car, but the lot was empty. Still, I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. I walked around to check the side of my car, and sure enough, There were fresh scratches along the paint, long, thin marks that hadn't been there before. They looked almost like claw marks, but I tried to convince myself it was just a branch or something I'd brushed against on the drive. I climbed back into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As the headlights flicked on, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the woods, a pale shape, low to the ground, darting between the trees. My heart started pounding. I leaned forward, squinting into the darkness, but whatever it was had vanished. I tried to shake it off and pulled out of the lot, but as I drove down the empty road, I kept seeing flashes of movement in my mirrors. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the back of the car. It was faint, but steady, like someone drumming their fingers on the metal. I checked my mirrors again, but there was nothing there. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and then I heard a low, guttural whisper, so quiet I almost missed it. It sounded like someone saying my name, over and over, just outside the window. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to focus on the road, but the whispering got louder, filling the car until it was all I could hear. Suddenly, something slammed against the back window, hard enough to rattle the glass. I jerked the wheel, nearly swerving off the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a pale, twisted face pressed against the glass, eyes wide and mouth stretched into a silent scream. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop on the shoulder, heart racing so fast I thought it would burst. I spun around, but the face was gone. The only thing left was a smear of something dark and sticky on the window, slowly dripping down the glass. I sat there, frozen, too scared to move, as the whispering faded into the night. I knew I had to get out of there. I floored the gas, tires spinning on the gravel as I tore down the highway, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and that gas station. But the further I drove, the more it felt like something was following me. The tapping started up again, this time on the passenger side window, soft at first, then growing louder and more frantic. I risked a glance and saw a pale hand, impossibly long fingers splayed against the glass, keeping pace with my car even as I pushed 70 miles an hour. The face appeared again, just outside the window, eyes locked on mine, mouth moving in a silent plea. I could see its breath fogging up the glass, leaving behind streaks that spelled out my name. I swerved, trying to shake it, but the thing clung to the side of the car, its body twisting and contorting in ways that didn't seem possible. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen was nothing but static. The whispering filled the car, louder than ever, drowning out the roar of the engine. In a final burst of panic, I slammed on the brakes and threw open the door, stumbling out onto the side of the road. The thing let out a guttural, inhuman wail and vanished into the darkness, leaving behind only the echo of its voice and the lingering smell of rot. I stood there, shaking, until the sun started to rise, too afraid to get back in the car, too scared to look back at the woods. When daylight finally broke, I forced myself to check the car. The scratches were still there, and the smear on the window had dried to a rusty brown stain. I drove straight to my parents' house and didn't say a word about what happened. I never told anyone, not my friends, not my family, not even my therapist. I avoided that stretch of road from then on, and I never stopped at another lonely gas station if I could help it. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that tapping on the window, or catch a glimpse of a pale face in my mirrors. I try to tell myself it was just exhaustion, just a trick of the mind. But every time I see a wall of missing person flyers, I wonder how many others never made it home. And I wonder if, one night, I'll see my own face staring back at me from one of those faded photos. I'm a 41-year-old woman, and this happened about a year ago, when I was driving home from a business trip in Southern Oregon. I'd left later than I planned, and by the time I was halfway home, it was well past midnight. The highway was empty, winding through thick forests and steep hills, and my phone had lost signal miles back. I was running low on gas, and my anxiety was starting to creep in. When I finally saw a sign for a gas station at the next exit, I felt a wave of relief. The place was tucked away off a narrow road, surrounded by towering pine trees. It looked old but open, with a single pump and a small, dimly lit store. There was only one other car in the lot, an old pickup with its hood up. I pulled in, telling myself I'd just fill up and get back on the road. But as soon as I stepped out of my car, I noticed how the air felt heavy, almost electric, and the silence was so complete it made my ears ring. I tried to brush it off, but something about the place made my skin crawl. I started pumping gas, glancing nervously at the pickup truck. Its hood was propped open, but I couldn't see anyone around. The store's windows were fogged up, and the only light came from a flickering bulb above the door. I tried to focus on the numbers ticking up on the pump, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. Every so often, I'd hear a faint rustling from the trees or the creak of metal from the pickup, but when I looked, there was nothing there. When I finished, I walked toward the store to pay. The inside was cramped and cluttered, with shelves of dusty snacks and faded postcards. The clerk was a thin, middle-aged man with deep circles under his eyes. He barely looked at me, just rang up my gas and mumbled the total. As I handed him my card, I noticed a strange smell, something sharp and metallic, almost like blood. I tried not to wrinkle my nose, but the clerk seemed to notice. He stared at me for a moment, then said, "You shouldn't be out here this late. Not alone." His words sent a chill through me. I tried to laugh it off, but he didn't smile. As I turned to leave, I glanced at a bulletin board near the door. It was covered in faded flyers, missing pets, lost hikers, even a couple of missing person notices. Most were old, but one looked recent, a woman about my age, with dark hair and a nervous smile. The date on the flyer was just a week earlier. I hurried back outside, my heart pounding. The pickup truck was still there, but now the driver's door was open, and I could see muddy footprints leading from the truck toward the edge of the woods. I told myself it was nothing, just someone fixing their engine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the darkness. I tried to calm myself down as I got back in my car, but my hands were shaking. I locked the doors and started the engine, glancing in the rearview mirror. The pickup truck was still sitting there, but now I could see movement in the trees just beyond the edge of the lot. It was subtle, just a shadow slipping between the trunks, too quick to make out. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but my gut told me otherwise. As I pulled out of the lot, my headlights swept across the trees, and for a split second, I saw someone standing just inside the tree line. They were tall and thin, wearing dark clothes, and their face was turned away. I pressed the gas, desperate to get back to the highway, but as I turned onto the road, I heard a loud thump from the trunk of my car, like something heavy had just landed on it. My heart leapt into my throat. I sped up, glancing in the mirror, but I couldn't see anything on the back of the car. The road was pitch black, and the only sound was the roar of my engine and my own ragged breathing. Then I heard it again, a scraping sound like fingernails dragging across metal coming from the roof. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to convince myself it was just a branch or some loose debris, but the sound kept getting louder, moving from the trunk to the roof, then to the passenger side window. I risked a glance and saw a pale hand pressed against the glass, fingers splayed wide, leaving streaks in the condensation. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the empty road. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, something slammed against the passenger window, hard enough to make the glass shudder. I screamed, fumbling for my phone, but the screen was black, no signal, no light, nothing. I looked up and saw a face peering in at me, eyes wide and unblinking, mouth twisted into a silent scream. The hand slid down the glass, leaving a trail of something dark and sticky. I threw the car into drive and floored it, not daring to look back as I sped down the highway. The face burned into my memory. I drove as fast as I could, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The road twisted and turned through the forest, and every time I glanced in the mirror, I half expected to see that face staring back at me from the back seat. The scraping sound faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, clinging to the car or hiding just out of sight. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the lights of a small town up ahead. I pulled into a brightly lit gas station, parked under the security cameras, and sat there for a long time, trying to catch my breath. I checked the roof and trunk, but there was nothing there, no handprints, no scratches, nothing to prove what I'd seen. My phone finally came back to life, and I called a friend, barely able to explain what had happened. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked under the lights, too afraid to drive any further. I kept the doors locked and the windows up, jumping at every sound. I never saw the pickup truck again, and I never found out who, or what, had been in the woods that night. But I knew deep down that if I'd stopped for even a second, if I'd gotten out to check the noise, I might not have made it out at all. I made it home the next day, exhausted and shaken. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and scared and seeing things that weren't there. But every time I close my eyes, I see that face at the window, those wide, desperate eyes staring right through me. I checked the news for days afterward, but there was nothing, No missing persons, no strange reports, nothing about that gas station or the pickup truck. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a faint scraping sound outside my window or catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows. I always make sure my doors are locked and my phone is charged just in case. I don't know what was out there in those woods or what it wanted, but I do know one thing. I'll never stop for gas in the middle of nowhere again. And if you ever find yourself alone at a gas station late at night, pay attention to the silence. Sometimes, it's not just the darkness you have to be afraid of. I'm a 27-year-old guy, and this happened to me 2 winters ago when I was driving cross-country to visit my brother in Colorado. I'd been on the road for almost 12 hours, and a snowstorm had rolled in way faster than the weather app predicted. By the time I hit the backroads in Nebraska, the snow was coming down so hard I could barely see the lines on the highway. My gas tank was running low, and I was starting to panic a little when I finally spotted a tiny gas station glowing through the whiteout. It looked like something out of a different era, just a single pump, a squat brick building, and a faded sign that barely lit up the swirling snow. There were no other cars, and the whole place was surrounded by empty fields and darkness. I pulled in, grateful just to get off the road for a minute. But as soon as I stepped out of my car, the wind died down, and the silence was so thick it felt unnatural. I remember thinking, for the first time that night, that maybe I should have just kept driving. I hurried to the pump, shivering, and started filling up. The snow was piling up fast, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots on the icy ground. I glanced at the building, expecting to see someone inside, but the windows were dark, except for a faint blue glow coming from behind the counter. I figured it was just a TV left on, but it made the place look even more deserted. When I finished, I tried the door, and it creaked open with a sound that made my skin crawl. Inside, the air was freezing, colder than it was outside, and the lights flickered overhead. The shelves were mostly empty, except for a few cans of soup and some ancient candy bars. There was a bell on the counter, so I rang it, but nobody came out. I called out, but my voice sounded weirdly muffled, like the walls were swallowing the sound. That's when I noticed the footprints. Wet, slushy prints led from the back door to the counter, then disappeared behind a rack of snacks. They were fresh, still melting into little puddles on the tile. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The blue glow I'd seen from outside was coming from a small TV on the counter, playing static. I started to feel like I was intruding, like I'd walked into someone else's nightmare. I tried to brush it off, telling myself the clerk was probably just in the bathroom or out back. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt like I was being watched. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the reflection of the freezer door, or hear a faint tapping from the back room. My heart was pounding, and I started to wonder if I should just leave some cash on the counter and get out of there. I was about to do just that, leave the money and bolt, when I heard a voice from the back room. It was low and shaky, almost like someone was talking to themselves. I froze, listening, but I couldn't make out the words. The voice got louder, then stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I backed away from the counter, my eyes darting around the store. The blue static from the TV flickered, casting weird shadows on the walls. I heard the dragging sound again, closer this time, and then a sharp, metallic clatter, like a can falling off a shelf. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" But there was no answer. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the store into darkness except for the blue glow of the TV. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. The only light was that cold, flickering static. I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the back room. They stopped just behind the snack rack, out of sight. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps started again, this time circling around the aisles, getting closer. I could hear breathing, raspy, uneven, like someone struggling to catch their breath. I ducked behind a shelf, heart pounding so loud I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. Then I saw a figure step into the blue light. It was a man, but something was wrong with him. His clothes were soaked, his skin pale and almost blue, and his eyes were wide and unfocused. He stared straight ahead, mumbling to himself, dragging one leg behind him. He didn't seem to notice me at first, but then he stopped, head snapping in my direction. He started muttering louder, words I couldn't understand, and began shuffling toward me, leaving a trail of wet footprints. I panicked and bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. I could hear the man's footsteps getting closer, the wet slap of his boots echoing in the dark. I pounded on the glass, screaming for help, but the snow outside swallowed the sound. The man was almost on me, his breath visible in the cold air, his eyes locked on mine. Just as he reached out, his hand brushing my shoulder, the lights snapped back on with a harsh buzz. The man recoiled, shielding his eyes, and let out a guttural, animal-like moan. I took the chance to shove past him, nearly slipping on the wet floor, and sprinted for the back door. It was unlocked, and I burst out into the freezing night, gasping for air. I didn't stop to look back. I ran around the building, slipping and sliding in the snow, until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the keys in the ignition. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the gas station. The man was standing in the doorway, staring at me with those wide, empty eyes. He didn't move, didn't shout, just watched as I peeled out of the lot, tires spinning on the ice. As I sped down the highway, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see him chasing after me through the snow. But the road was empty, and the gas station disappeared into the blizzard behind me. My heart was still racing, and I could barely breathe, but I didn't stop driving until I saw the lights of the next town. I made it to a motel and locked myself in my room, barely sleeping that night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, that maybe the man was hurt or sick and I'd overreacted. But when I mentioned the gas station to the motel clerk, he just gave me a strange look and said there hadn't been a working station on that stretch of road for years. He told me the old place had burned down after a bad accident and nobody ever rebuilt it. I drove past the spot in daylight just to see for myself. All I found was a blackened foundation, half buried in snow, and a rusted sign barely visible through the drifts. No pump, no building, no blue glow, just emptiness. I still don't know what I saw that night, or who that man was. But sometimes, when it's snowing and the world goes quiet, I remember those wet footprints and the way he stared at me, and I wonder if some places never really let go of the people lost there. And I know, if I ever see a lonely gas station glowing in a blizzard again, I'll keep driving, no matter how empty my tank is.